Okay, so last video here for assignment 14, we have my Titanic tree, and I'm hoping this turns out better than my NFL tree did. But one thing I did, just a note on that, is I'm sure these are watched kind of in order here. One thing I did realize is just how helpful this is in terms of decision tree to see how your clusters are being made. And just like referring back to my NFL tree, looking back at it now, I can see how some of the values I had in there, I need probably to take out, because using this now as a tool and seeing like, okay, this is how it's making the decisions of the clusters, I could see that these zero values were really having an effect on how things are being clustered out, and maybe it wasn't really painting the true picture of what I wanted. So looking at this, this looks like a lot more cleaned up here, but same deal. We got the file in here, cluster is the target variable, and we'll check out our tree, see what it did for the clustering here. All right. So the most important variable that it used to decide how to group was if you survived or not. Surprise, surprise. And we can look here, and it looks like almost 47%, excuse me, of the values that were clustered out belong to group 4, cluster 4. And then from there, it's for the breakdown for all the other values that didn't belong to cluster 4, or maybe didn't survive. We can see that essentially the first variable here is survival. So 1 being you did, 0 being you didn't. So if you did survive, there was actually a 55.6% chance you'd be in cluster 1. If you didn't, there's about a 75.2% chance that you belong to cluster 4. And from there, the next variable it went into to determine what cluster it's going to place these values in was passenger class. So what, were they riding coach? Were they riding first class? Were they riding, what, how, I guess I don't know the best way to phrase it, but essentially 1 through 3 or 4 classes, where were you at in that in the ship when you booked on? So starting from the left here, we can see if you were in first class, you had a 90, if you didn't survive and you were in first class, you had a 99% chance of being in C2. Only one value was not in C2. If you were a class higher, or essentially lower in this context of classes, than class 1, you had a 89% chance of being in class 4. And then going over to the other side here, again, we can see if you were in first class, you were grouped into C2, most likely, 99% chance. If you were not in first class, you were almost definitely going to be grouped into C1. And it's kind of interesting here, I guess. I'm not sure how common this is, but then the third variable or variables that the decision tree went into from these branches on this side was siblings and spouses. So how many people were aboard with you? And on this side, it was age. So looking at it over here, if you did not survive and you were in something other than first class, you had an 88.6% chance of being in C4. From that, it then looked at how many other people did you have with you on the boat. If you had less than or equal to 2, you had a 95.1% chance of being in C4. If you had more than 2, you belong to C3. And we can see that C3 is 100% based on this subdivision or leaf of C4. And if we go over to if you did survive to this side, if you did survive and now you were in a class that was not class 1, anything but class 1, the next variable it used was age. This is actually kind of interesting. So if you were younger, if you did survive and you were younger than or equal to 39 years old, you had a 97.3% chance of being in class 1. If you were older than 39, you had a 75% chance of being in class 2. And then once again, it goes into the passenger class and kind of divvies it up some more from there. So interesting to see, 500 survived, 809 did not. Of those 500, the majority of them actually weren't in first class. And it may be the idea that second class, third class, fourth class, those other classes had more people in general. So more values in there. But then looking at it from there, most of the people that weren't in first class, 222. So the majority of them were young people, which makes sense. Younger folk, not as much money flowing through. But anyway, I find this decision tree very interesting and a very good way to look back on your clustering and verify whether or not does my clustering make sense? Is the way that this is being broken up, does it tell the story I want it to tell? Does it show I want it to show? And I think this is a good example. I think this is a pretty decent breakdown from this data. And then again, reflecting back on my NFL one, I didn't really realize how some of the values were impacting my clustering until I looked at it visually from how the decisions were being made. So I think this is an awesome tool to show you a visual representation of the math. And I think this is very visually appealing and very easy to understand. So a great tool. Enjoyed using it. Hope to use it more in the future. But for now, that is the end of my assignment, end of the semester. I'll rock and roll and ready for January. Thank you, sir.